All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started about talking about CloudTrail today. And if you have questions, I've got the chat window open, and you can just put your questions in the chat window, and we'll handle them as we kind of walk through the content, or maybe at the end. So we're going to jump right in here and talk a little bit just generally about some concepts for CloudTrail. The first is just let's define what CloudTrail is. It's really an auditing, compliance, and governance tool that is also, I think, one of the most important troubleshooting tools that you have access to. I often joke when we're talking as a team about problems we're having, the first thing that I say is have you checked CloudTrail? It is really super important, and it's one of the must-have services that I would consider should be enabled in every single one of your AWS accounts. Ultimately, what CloudTrail is going to do is record all activity that occurs within your account, and then you can use that information to satisfy audit requirements, compliance requirements, or as I mentioned, any troubleshooting that you might need to do within the environment. So let's have a look at some general terms and concepts first. The very first thing that you're going to do is you're going to create a trail. So, what exactly is a trail? This is the foundation of the service itself. And this gives you an opportunity to configure the events that you want CloudTrail to record on your behalf, but also provide configuration details about the trail itself. And we'll dive into that in a bit here, but things like integration with CloudWatch, um, encrypting logs with KMS, generating notifications. These are all the types of things that you define when you create a trail. Another type of trail that you can create is what's called an organizations trail or an organizational trail. This does require the AWS organizations service to be enabled within your account structure, and all features of AWS organizations must be enabled. What's interesting about the organizational trail is it does simplify the deployment of CloudFormation if you're running in a multi-account deployment. So this gives you, uniformity. I can't say that word. It allows you to ensure that the configuration is uniform across all the accounts. There we go. Okay, including naming of the trails themselves, centralized logging in an S3 bucket. The one thing that I would say is, at least right now, you do lose some of the flexibility that you may gain by using a non-organizational trail deployment. But this is definitely something that if you're just getting started, I would recommend that you look at. Within CloudTrail, there are three different types of events that you capture. The first is what Amazon calls management events. These are enabled by default. And the simple definition of this is management events are activities that are recorded by CloudTrail that are performed against the resources in your account. Okay. And you'll also see these referred to as control plane operations. So, as an example, let's say I log in and I make a change to a security group within an account. Well, that's an activity being performed against a resource within your account, and that would be recorded by CloudTrail as a management event. The other type of event that you have are data events. It is important to note that these are not enabled by default. And when you do enable them, there's going to be some additional charges with your CloudTrail deployment, but absolutely you should enable them. And you can see the difference between management and data events. Data events record activities performed on or in your AWS resources. So a really easy example of this is, let's say you've got Lambda functions, and somebody or an application that you're running invokes that Lambda function with an invoke API call. That would be an example of a data event. Okay, so if you've enabled data events, you would also capture that. You'll also see these referred to as data plane operations. Now, finally, we have insight events. These are relatively new, and insight events are meant to provide you with, well, insight into abnormal or unusual activity that's occurring within your AWS account. So this is something that you have to turn on. There is additional fees for insight events, but effectively what it's going to do is look for API calls that are out of the ordinary and record those. It'll also separate those insight events from all the other events assuming here that we've got CloudTrail integrated with S3, you'll see them in your S3 bucket where you're dumping your logs, and they are separated by a different prefix. Once you have, actually, let me be careful here. By default, CloudTrail is enabled in every AWS account. It will only record 90 days of activity, though. So this is what is called the trail history. You can get to the trail history through the management console. You can also run a CLI command to get this information. And it's going to, you can see, sorry, the screenshot's a little small, but when the event occurred, who or what did it, so our username, the event name. Okay, so you can see in my example here, a bunch of assume role API calls, the resource types that are associated with that call, and any error codes. Up in the top right-hand corner of that screenshot, there's a little gear icon. So we can change what shows here in the console view. And you can see at the top, you can also filter, you can select time ranges. So this is a really simple way to dig through the logs. So I joked earlier on, have you checked CloudTrail? Whenever we have a customer call us about something that isn't working the way they would expect, I tend to start in the trail history. And if I know what that person was trying to do, or I have a username, I'm going to set up the filter, and I'm going to look for typically error codes, access denied generally, for a user, right? So let's say, a user Joe calls me and says they tried to make a change to a security group and they got an access denied. The first thing I'm going to do is go into CloudTrail, and I'm going to look for the API or the event that Joe tried to invoke, and then work backwards, because we are practicing least privilege in our accounts. And I would maybe have to add some permissions for Joe to actually do that work. Okay, so the trail history is going to be an important part of leveraging CloudTrail, primarily for, I think, troubleshooting. For the most part, CloudTrail supports the majority of the services that are available. So, like the 165 or 170 services. Having said that, there are some services that aren't completely supported. So, I would always check the documentation to make sure you have the latest information. You can see there, sorry, the link is a little truncated, but you could follow that link to get the most current information about services that are not supported by the CloudTrail implementation as of today. Like all services in AWS, there are service limits. And just before we jump into the details here, remember there are two types of service limits. There's a soft limit and a hard limit. A soft limit is something that we can basically open a support ticket with technical support and have them increase the limit, right? You go from 5 VPCs to 10 VPCs as an example. A hard limit is something that cannot be changed. So before going down the path too far in any service, CloudTrail included, I would always recommend that you check the documentation, understand the service limits, which ones are soft, which ones are hard, and that's gonna help you make better informed decisions about what your implementation of CloudTrail or really any other service that you may use in your deployments. And like the last slide here, sorry it's a little small, but you can follow that link and see the current service limits, both soft and hard, for CloudTrail. Finally, CloudTrail is a regional service, which means within our AWS accounts, we would want to, best practice would be to say, enable CloudTrail in every region, in every one of your AWS accounts. And it is supported in most commercial regions. However, there are some, I don't want to call it limitations, but I can't think of a better word right now. If you're running in GovCloud, or you have a deployment in Beijing, the Beijing region, China region, you should have a look at the link there that I've shared again in the slides. There are some unique features, I guess, or potential limitations that you would want to be aware of. But for any of the regular commercial regions, you should have no problem with CloudTrail being supported in the regions that you're using. So that's a little bit about some high level terms and concepts as it relates to CloudTrail. I always like to put this slide up in our webinars. It's always the same. How do you manage CloudTrail? You can manage CloudTrail through the management console. I showed you that little screenshot already of the event history. You can manage it through the SDK, or through the CLI. So you've got options here. Generally, we would do a lot of our troubleshooting through the management console, right? I gave you that example already of a user trying to do something. We're going to start in the management console and very quickly look to see if we can identify the action that that user tried to perform, and work backwards from there to maybe manage an IAM policy that's associated with their account, or maybe a resource-based policy associated to the resource that they're trying to interact with. If we are configuring or managing the configuration of a CloudTrail deployment for one of our customers, we would tend to do that programmatically. We tend to create Bodo scripts, so we're using the Python SDK, or we would be using the AWS CLI to interact with the CloudTrail implementations. But you have options here, like every service in AWS. So through the management console, through an SDK, or through a CLI. There are a number of factors that influence the overall cost of your CloudTrail implementation. The first thing, remember, is that, sorry, I said managed events here, but I should have typed management events. Management events are free. Okay, so that they're enabled by default. The first copy of those management events is free. If you were to make multiple copies of those management events, you can see you're going to incur an additional charge of $2 per 100,000 events. Data events I mentioned already are not enabled by default, and there is an additional charge for those, so 10 cents per 100,000. And then the insight events we mentioned already, looking for unusual or abnormal activity based on the APIs that are being, or basically the activity that's occurring within your AWS account. Those also incur an additional charge, 35 cents per 100,000 events that are being recorded. I put the link to the CloudTrail pricing page at the bottom of this slide. Like, when I mentioned service limits, or supported regions, basically always check the latest pricing page. Amazon, is continuously pushing down costs to run services. So just double check that to be sure that what I've got on this slide is correct. And remember, there might be slight variations between the different regions as well. So you would want to just make sure you understand what are the potential costs of deploying CloudTrail within your environment. I would say, again, as I mentioned early on, this is what we consider a must-have service. So we build the pricing into all of our customer deployments because it is a really important tool. Outside of the cost associated with the actual event data that you're capturing, you are going to have CloudTrail integrated with other services, right? Whether it's the simple storage service, the simple notification service, the key management service, even CloudWatch Logs. So you will have potentially other costs for those services as well. So you've got the core costs for the actual trail implementation, and then depending on where you store your logs, integration, all those kinds of things, you could have some additional costs. So you're going to have to look at those services independently and make sure you understand the potential costs associated with a trail deployment. Now, again, we always talk about identity and access management, or IAM, in all of our webinars, and the slides for the most part look exactly the same. But I think it's something that is very important to talk about, because identity and access management is really, I describe it as the foundation of the security within your deployment, and it's often overlooked in the rush to get something deployed, or it's overlooked because it's, well, to be honest, boring compared to other services. So the very first thing that we always like to point out here is that let's practice least privilege. When you create IAM users within your account, you should not be making all of those users administrators. What we're trying to do here is protect the data in our environment, the resources within the environments that we create, ensure the integrity of, in this case, CloudTrail log files, CloudTrail configuration. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to practice least privilege. And generally, the way that we approach this is to start with an AWS provided managed policy. We don't normally deploy managed policies. We normally take those managed policies and modify them to meet your particular requirements, right? Because what I find is you may need a little more than read access, but you don't need, let's say, power access. You need something in between, or you exist between power and admin. So what you would often do is take one of those managed policies and slice and dice it and get it the way that you would expect. So always practice least privilege. While not related exactly to CloudTrail, I would also say regularly review the permissions policies that you're assigning to the entities within your AWS account. And the easiest way to do this is with the IAM Access Advisor, right? Just a simple tab that you can go and look at, and you can say, hey, here are all the permissions that are assigned to these entities. When was the last time they actually used those permissions? And this is a way that you can continuously evaluate the permission policies that you've deployed and tighten them up. Okay, so we would want to do this with CloudTrail. And one of I think the most important resources, documentation resources that you can use is IAM Actions. And for every service, there is an IAM Actions page that define the different AMI calls that can be made, right? The gets, the puts, the describe commands, all those. So I've put a link here to the IAM Actions that are specific for CloudTrail. And so I've mentioned a couple times already, I'm going to get this printed on a t-shirt. Always start with CloudTrail. The very next thing we do is once we understand maybe what's gone wrong, we would then basically throw in, your favorite search engine, IAM Actions, and then the service name. You can do the exact same thing with CloudTrail. And this would give you the ability to create a policy that you could assign to users within your account to give them just enough access to CloudTrail. Okay, we don't want anybody accidentally deleting a trail or changing the configuration of a trail if they really shouldn't have that access in the first place. So always practice least privilege. When you are finishing the configuration, and I say that because remember that we're going to have by default CloudTrail enabled, but we're only going to have a finite amount of log data that we can search through. So in order to satisfy audit requirements, you most likely are going to have to persist CloudTrail event log data somewhere else. And you could do that into S3. Okay. Remember that by default, S3 buckets are private. That means that in order to actually have CloudTrail be able to write log data to the S3 bucket that you define, you are going to have to assign a bucket policy to that S3 bucket in order to allow the service CloudTrail to talk to the S3 bucket. Okay. So there's a link here at the bottom that also gives you some sample bucket policies that you could use for CloudTrail. If you don't have a proper bucket policy in place, your CloudTrail deployment will fail. Okay, I can't quite remember. I think if you're going through the management console, it'll actually set up the S3 bucket and the policy automatically. But as I mentioned earlier on, in most cases, we're going to do a lot of this work programmatically. So we're going to use CloudFormation, which means we have to kind of work backwards, set the bucket up, assign the policy to the bucket, and then deploy CloudTrail. If you don't deploy that policy, or the policy is not correct, you'll have basically a timeout error will occur because CloudTrail will actually try to test its access to that S3 bucket, and it will time out, it'll fail, and it'll kick back in CloudTrail an error. Okay. Optionally, you can integrate CloudTrail events with the simple notification service. So you can create a topic, and that topic would have one or more subscribers, and now you could push off CloudTrail event data into that SNS topic, which would notify whoever is subscribed or whatever is subscribed to that topic. I would be a little careful with this. You may end up generating a whole lot of notifications depending on what your configuration looks like. So it's an option, but just make sure that you understand what it is exactly that you're trying to accomplish before integrating the simple notification service into CloudTrail. Like I mentioned on the previous slide with S3, if you deploy during the deployment of CloudTrail, if you're doing that through the management console, a lot of the permissions requirements for, in this case, sending a message off to an SNS topic, it's managed for you as part of the deployment process. It'll do it behind the scenes. Like in my previous example, if you're going to do this programmatically, you're going to have to kind of work backwards, have the topic, set up the permissions policy so that when you're deploying your CloudTrail CloudTrail, it actually has the permissions it requires to publish a message to an SNS topic. One of my favorite integrations outside of S3 is the CloudWatch Logs. If you're not familiar with CloudWatch Logs, it's a newish feature, I guess. I figure it's been around for a little bit now, that allows us to persist log data to the CloudWatch service on the Amazon platform. So we can do this for operating system logs with the CloudWatch Logs agent, but the CloudTrail implementation also supports CloudWatch Logs. So now we can take log data, publish it to CloudWatch Logs, and then from that point, we can create metric filters to do notifications. You can also use CloudWatch Logs insights if you needed to very quickly look for something. So I gave you the example already in the CloudTrail history, where I could go in and just search by a specific event name, a specific username, and a time range and have a look. If you wanted to go back further and you had your expiration period set up with your CloudWatch Logs log group, you could, in theory, go back even further than maybe 90 days in the trail history and have a look by writing SQL-like queries in the CloudWatch Logs insights tool and point it to your log group that you've integrated with CloudTrail. Okay, sounds confusing. There's a lot of services involved here, but the nice thing is it's all managed and it's really easy to implement. Okay. Just like we've said before, though, you've got now service CloudTrail talking to another service, CloudWatch Logs. So you need an IAM role here that's going to allow CloudTrail to interact with the log groups, the log streams, push events into the log streams. So you'd have to look at the documentation and make sure that if you wanted to go down the CloudWatch Logs persistent path, that you've got the right IAM role in place. And this is what we would normally do. We actually publish to S3 as well as CloudWatch Logs. I mentioned earlier on the concept of an organizational trail, and that an organizational trail simplifies the deployment of a CloudTrail implementation across multiple accounts in the same AWS organization. Another feature another feature of AWS organizations are service control policies, or SCPs. Service control policies in general provide us with JSON policies, like a very similar to what you would see in an identity or a resource-based policy, and these exist outside of our account. So they give us the ability to control what actions can be performed in an account, but we can also control administrators as well as the root user in those accounts. And the SCPs that we deploy exist outside of the AWS account. So they're, again, a really important tool, not only to help protect your implementation of CloudTrail, but any number of services. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but to get service control policies, you do need to have all features enabled in your organization. Assuming that you have all features enabled, this is a little snippet of a really simple service control policy. We've actually deployed this for a customer. We've actually run it in our own AWS organization to control what can happen against the trails that we have deployed across all of our AWS accounts. So you can see here again, it looks just like a regular IAM policy. We've got effect, action, and resource. In this case, we're defining an explicit deny statement, and we're denying actions against the CloudTrail service. If you're not quite familiar with organizations, what it allows us to do is logically group AWS accounts together in organizational units and then create SCPs, our control policies, assign those directly to accounts or to OUs, and those SCPs will flow down to the member accounts. When you deploy organizations, Amazon will deploy a default policy. I want to say they call it allow full access. And it's basically effect, allow, action star, resource star. So what we're doing here now is we're saying, hey, allow the full access to still work, but if somebody tries to perform one of the actions we have defined here against the CloudTrail service, deny that activity. Okay, so they flow down, and they also, I can't remember what the word is I'm looking for, but they basically, for lack of a better word, they bundle up all the SCPs and apply them. right? So, and remember that just like a regular IAM policy, a deny statement will always win, an explicit deny. So even if the administrator in an account where I have this assigned, even if somebody logs in as the root user in an account where this policy is assigned, this SCP will win. Okay. So that's why it's really important. And I'm just showing you here CloudTrail, but we would use this for things like AWS Config, Amazon Guard Duty, Amazon Security Hub, kind of those core security services that we want to make sure one are enabled and two aren't modified at the account level. Another good supporting service or key supporting service is KMS, the key management service. Key management allows us to basically leverage a managed service to perform cryptographic operations within our environment, both encryption and decryption operations. One of the things that you want to do when you deploy your CloudTrail trail and you've integrated with S3 is to protect those log files at rest. So CloudTrail supports KMS, or it is integrated with KMS, and you can create your own key and use that key to protect the log files at rest that are being stored in an S3 bucket. So this is another, I would say, required step when you're deploying CloudTrail. Okay, use key management service to protect the logs. So that's kind of some of the key, what I call the key supporting services that you are going to be leveraging when you deploy a trail. Let's talk a little bit about, at a high level, the steps that are required to set up CloudTrail. The very first decision you're going to have to make is, are you going to use an organizational trail or what I'll call a standalone trail? I mentioned already that an organizational trail simplifies the deployment. It ensures that CloudTrail is configured the same way. I didn't want to try to say that word again, the same way across all of the accounts within your organization. Okay. And it makes the maintenance of that deployment a little easier. But I mentioned already that at least in the current implementation of AWS organizations, it does remove some of the flexibility that you have. What we often like to do is create, for lack of a better word, a security account, or maybe you might call it a logging account. With an organizational deployment right now, we lose the ability to decide which S3 bucket in which account we want to use. Okay, that's all kind of managed at the AWS organizations level. Uh, excuse me. What you're seeing in AWS organizations is, as the service matures, Amazon's introducing a feature about it. I think it's called Delegated Administrator. And what that allows you to do is basically assign something other than the master account as the administrator for that service. And there are a couple features or services that already support that. IAM Access Analyzer, and they just introduced, I want to say it was Guard Duty, also supports organizational deployments with delegated administrator right now. So that means I could, in my example here, delegate the security account as the master account for a Guard Duty implementation. The other services, as far as I know, the last time I looked at the documentation, while they're supported by AWS organizations, they don't give you the ability to delegate the administration account for that. It will be the master account in your organization. So this is the first decision you have to make. Right now, we are still going with a standalone trail deployment. Because we're using CloudFormation to deploy all of the services that we deploy for our customers, including CloudTrail, we are able to ensure the sameness of all of the implementations of CloudTrail. This gives us the flexibility, in my case, to pull all that data back into a security account or a logging account, whatever you'd like to call it. S3 obviously is going to be an important service here. Once you've decided on the deployment method, organizational versus a standalone deployment, you're going to need to decide where to store those logs. And I've mentioned a couple times already, we would recommend that you store all of those logs in a single AWS account. Having said that, in many cases, we actually end up with a couple trails in our customers' accounts. Now, we know this costs more money because what we talked about earlier on, first copy of management events are free, second copies are not. But what this allows us to do is get a centralized copy of the logs where we have very fine grained control over who or what has access to those logs to ensure we have a copy of those logs that can satisfy audit or compliance or governance requirements. But we also have a copy of the logs locally for the owners of those accounts. Maybe we've got some development happening in those accounts. It gives them quick access to the S3 logs that are specific to that account. So that's how we do it. I've got a reference architecture here I'll show as we wrap up the slides, but we tend to put all of the accounts in a central account at a minimum. And then if the customer requires it, we'll keep a local copy in that AWS account for basically easy access. And then you've got your decision around simple notification service. You may want to configure this, but as I mentioned before, you may end up generating a potentially high volume of notifications, and you would end up, for lack of a better word, potentially spamming yourself. So this is an optional step. We don't normally do this. We normally push all of our CloudTrail information to CloudWatch Logs, which I think is on the next slide here. So this is actually what we do rather than SNS. It's an optional step again, and this is our preferred way of generating notifications. Once we have all of the logs, or sorry, all of the CloudWatch events pushed into CloudWatch Logs, we can then use metric filters. And if you're not familiar, a metric filter is really just a JSON a document that you create that you can use to filter for specific API calls that are being logged by CloudTrail or other services. So this gives us a little more control, I think, over what actually generates notifications. We may be interested in high value tasks or high value actions, like if somebody terminates an EC2 instance. But if somebody just reboots an EC2 instance, maybe we don't care about that. With the metric filters in CloudWatch Logs, it just gives us more control over what generates events. So that's kind of at a high level, the decision making that you have to do for an implementation of CloudTrail. So what we've got here is an example of a multi-account deployment where we've deployed CloudTrail across what we're calling our central and our production account. And you can see that CloudTrail is doing a couple things. It's pushing or keeping that local copy in S3. It's also publishing event data to CloudWatch Logs. And then from CloudWatch Logs, we can create metric filters to generate notifications or maybe even take automated actions, invoke a Lambda function when something happens. So you might have an example of when you see somebody allow public access to an S3 bucket, right? That would be a data event potentially. You could capture that event and then invoke a Lambda function to remove public access from that S3 bucket, okay, by looking at the API call that's captured by CloudTrail. But then we've also got a copy of our logs being centrally stored in our logging or our security account in an S3 bucket. So this could help us satisfy both local audit requirements. Our users in the central account, for example, could use CloudWatch Logs insights, or they might be able to comb through S3 and have a look for the event data. They could always use the trail history if they wanted in their own account for troubleshooting locally in that account. But in the logging account, we now can satisfy our audit requirements by having a secure copy there. So we'll wrap up here just with some quick best practices, most of which I think we've covered already. One of the features when you integrate CloudTrail into S3 is something called log validation. And just to make this as simple as possible, essentially what log validation does is generate a hash on all the log files as they're written to the S3 bucket. And this provides us with the ability to ensure that those log files have not been tampered with. Okay, somebody hasn't modified them. If log file validation is enabled and a log file was modified, you would get an alert that would tell you when that log file was modified. The other thing, you know what, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if we have this in the slide deck or not, but another thing that we should do as best practice, if I flip back a couple slides here, in each of these accounts, remember that S3 supports access logging. So I would have S3 access logging enabled on, at a minimum, the storage buckets for my CloudWatch log events. And every time somebody or something makes a call to an object within our logging bucket, we could store that access information in another bucket. So if you think about that combined with log file validation, when something changes, you could go back and have a look at who made that change. Okay, so enable S3 access logging as well. I mentioned already that CloudWatch Logs is our preferred implementation. So I would suggest that you use CloudWatch Logs, simple monitoring of those important events. You can use the logs insight to write SQL-like queries to get the data that you want. You could also generate or create metric filters that generate notifications out to your administrators or potentially take actions by invoking Lambda events on your behalf. Protect your log files, which means using server-side encryption in S3 with the KMS service. Protect those log files at rest. Okay, you want to make sure that you know that they can't be tampered with, and that you've protected them from accidental disclosure by using encryption. S3 has a feature called Lifecycle Management. If you're not familiar, this allows us to create rules that as files age over time, we can move them through the various storage classes that exist within S3 to help us manage our overall costs. We can also eventually archive that data into Glacier or potentially delete that data permanently. So using S3 Lifecycle Event Management on your logging buckets is a great way to help you manage your overall costs, right? What's the likelihood of needing maybe a CloudWatch log file 150 days into the future, right? If your security team has compliance requirements that says every log file must be kept for 365 days, you could then say, hey, retain this file for 365 days. On the 366th day, delete it. So you can move it through the different storage classes and maintain the overall cost of that S3 logging bucket that you're using for CloudTrail or potentially other services. This isn't specific for CloudTrail. And that is our 101 introduction to CloudTrail. I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you had any questions, you could just type them into the chat window here and I can handle them for you now or get back to you. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, I think we'll call it there. I will share this up in our YouTube channel probably within a day or two. So if you wanted to go back and refer to it later on, you can find exactly what you maybe missed or wanted to hear again in our YouTube channels. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. I know it's tough to find some time out of the office sometimes to sit and listen to these webinars. So I really appreciate it. I also appreciate the patience. I know we had a couple false starts on this one. So thank you very much for joining me today. Stay safe and talk later. Bye-bye.